My name is Emily Carter. I'm 34 years old, and I've always been the daughter my family called when everything was about to fall apart. My life shifted the morning I got a call from the hospital saying my mother had suffered a mild stroke and needed someone to sign emergency paperwork. I drove there in a panic, believing this time might be different. But when she opened her eyes, the first thing she asked wasn't whether I was okay. She asked if I could help clean up my brother's financial mess. In that moment, the truth I had avoided for years finally became impossible to ignore. I wasn't loved for being her daughter. I was needed only when I could absorb the consequences meant for someone else. That day, I made a decision to stop. No arguments, no dramatic exit, just a quiet refusal to keep playing a role I never agreed to. I thought that choice was the end of it, until later that night. After I got home, there was a knock at my door carrying a request I wasn't prepared to hear. If you want to know what came with that knock, stay with me for a moment. Because to understand why I could make a decision I couldn't undo, I need to take you back to where this story really began. I was raised to believe that being needed was the same thing as being loved. That if I stayed useful, if I stayed quiet, if I didn't ask for too much, I would earn my place. That belief didn't arrive all at once. It settled into me slowly, year by year, the way humidity settles into a house until you don't notice the air has become heavy. I didn't grow up in chaos. There were no screaming matches every night, no dramatic exits, no moments that would have looked alarming from the outside. What I grew up in was something quieter and more confusing. A household where expectations were uneven, where affection came with conditions, and where I learned early on that my role was to stabilize everyone else, no matter the cost to myself. My mother liked to say she was just being practical. She raised us alone after my father left when I was 9, and that explanation followed her everywhere. At school meetings, at family gatherings, even in casual conversations with neighbors, she framed herself as a woman who had no room for weakness. I understood that story. I believed it for a long time. I watched her juggle bills, work long hours, and come home exhausted. I told myself that her sharp tone wasn't cruelty, it was stress, that her distance wasn't indifference, it was survival. I built empathy for her before I ever built it for myself. My brother was 3 years younger than me. From the outside, we probably looked like a normal pair of siblings. Inside the house, though, our roles couldn't have been more different. He was protected in ways I wasn't. His mistakes were explained away as phases, as growing pains, as things he would eventually outgrow. Mine were treated as character flaws. If he forgot something, it was because he was overwhelmed. If I did, it meant I wasn't trying hard enough. I noticed these differences early, but I didn't have language for them. I just adjusted. I learned how to read my mother's mood the moment she walked through the door. I learned when to speak and when to disappear into my room. I learned how to preempt conflict by fixing things before they became visible problems. I cleaned without being asked. I took on responsibilities quietly. When my brother struggled in school, I helped him study. When money was tight, I stopped asking for things. I told myself this was what being mature looked like. People praised me for being responsible, and I mistook that praise for care. By the time I was in my teens, being the reliable one had become my identity. Teachers trusted me, friends leaned on me, adults described me as old for my age. I wore that description like armor. It felt safer to be dependable than to be vulnerable. Vulnerability didn't seem to have a place in my family. Strength did, or at least the appearance of it. When I got my first part-time job, my paycheck didn't feel like money. I handed money over without being asked, framing it as helping out. My mother accepted it without comment, as though this was simply the natural order of things. I didn't resent her then. I felt proud. Proud to be useful. Proud to contribute. Proud to be the one who could handle things. If any part of this sounds familiar to you, if you recognize that quiet pride mixed with exhaustion, you're not imagining it. You're not alone in learning this pattern early. College was my first glimpse of what life felt like outside that dynamic. I moved away on a partial scholarship, worked 2 jobs, and learned how to support myself without constant monitoring. The distance gave me room to breathe, but it didn't break the pattern. I still answered every call. I still stepped in whenever there was a problem. My brother dropped out of one program after another, drifting between plans. Each time, my mother worried aloud, and each time, I felt the familiar pull to help. After graduation, I built a stable career. Nothing glamorous, nothing flashy, but solid. Health insurance, a savings account, a sense that I was finally standing on my own. That stability became another thing my family leaned on. When my brother needed help covering rent, my mother asked if I could manage it just this once. When a bill came due, she asked if I could float it until things settled. Each request came wrapped in reassurance. This is temporary. He's figuring things out. You're strong. You can handle it. I didn't notice how often those words were directed only at me. Strong, capable, independent. Compliments that sounded supportive, but carried an unspoken expectation. You don't need help. You don't need rest. You don't need consideration. There were moments when something in me stirred, when I wondered what it would feel like to be chosen first instead of relied upon last. Those thoughts made me uncomfortable. They felt selfish. I pushed them away and doubled down on being useful. When my brother made a series of financial decisions that spiraled into real consequences, the pattern intensified. Late fees became collections notices. Temporary help became ongoing support. My mother's concern sharpened into urgency. She spoke in hushed tones, as if worry itself was a kind of currency. And every time, her eyes found mine. I told myself this was family, that families show up, that sacrifice was normal. I didn't ask who was showing up for me. The years blurred together in a rhythm of work, responsibility, and quiet resentment I didn't want to admit existed. I was tired in a way sleep didn't fix. I carried a constant low-grade anxiety, always anticipating the next call, the next crisis. Even on good days, part of me stayed alert, braced for impact. I told myself this was just adulthood, that everyone felt this way, that once things stabilized, once my brother got back on his feet, things would ease. There was always a future point where relief waited. I just had to keep going until I reached it. The truth is, I had been preparing for a life of endurance, not a life of fulfillment. I didn't see it clearly then. I only felt the weight of it. When my mother's health began to decline in small, subtle ways, that weight grew heavier. Doctor's appointments, medication schedules, conversations about what would happen if things got worse. I stepped into the role automatically. I organized information. I coordinated logistics. I absorbed worry. My brother expressed concern, but his involvement stayed abstract. Mine was practical. I remember one evening sitting alone in my apartment, staring at my phone after another call that ended with my mother thanking me for being dependable. I realized I couldn't remember the last time she had asked how I was doing without tying it to a problem that needed solving. The realization didn't explode. It settled. Quiet. Heavy. I didn't confront her. I didn't know how. I had built my entire relationship with her around not being difficult, around not asking for emotional space, around being the one who made things easier. Questioning that role felt like pulling at a thread that might unravel everything. So I stayed silent. Again. What I didn't understand then was that silence doesn't preserve relationships. It preserves patterns, and patterns, left untouched, harden into expectations. By the time the hospital call came, the ground had already been cracking beneath me for years. I just hadn't been looking down. The version of me who rushed through those automatic doors believed, on some level, that crisis would finally reset things, that vulnerability would invite tenderness, that fear would soften my mother's voice, that shared urgency would remind her that I was her daughter, not just her backup plan. I didn't know yet that moments like that don't change dynamics. They reveal them. And once you see something clearly, you can't unsee it. You can only decide what to do next. The hospital room smelled faintly of disinfectant and something metallic I couldn't quite place. The monitors hummed in a steady rhythm, a sound that should have been reassuring but wasn't. I stood beside the bed watching my mother sleep, her face softer than I was used to seeing it, lines eased by medication and exhaustion. In that quiet moment, it would have been easy to feel close to her. Easy to believe that whatever distance had existed between us would dissolve now that she needed rest instead of answers. But closeness isn't created by proximity. It's created by attention. And even then, I could feel the familiar space between us, the space where questions about me never landed. When she woke up, she looked at me with a mixture of relief and expectation. Relief that someone competent was there, expectation that I would handle what came next. The nurse explained the situation in calm, careful terms. Mild stroke. No immediate danger. Lifestyle changes would be important. Follow-up appointments, physical therapy, monitoring. My mother nodded along, her eyes drifting toward me when logistics came up. Without discussion, without asking, the role assignment happened. I signed forms. I took notes. I asked clarifying questions. I made sure instructions were clear. It felt automatic, like muscle memory. I didn't notice my brother's absence until later, when the room grew quieter and the nurse left us alone. "He's worried," my mother said, as if explaining something I might not understand. "This has been hard on him." I waited for the rest of the sentence. It never came. No mention of how it felt for me. No acknowledgement that I had dropped everything to be there. No curiosity about whether I was scared too. I nodded, because nodding was easier than asking why his worry mattered more than my presence. That night, I went home exhausted in a way that felt deeper than physical tiredness. My thoughts looped without resolution. I replayed conversations, not because anything dramatic had happened, but because nothing had. The absence of recognition echoed louder than conflict ever could. In the days that followed, I rearranged my life without consciously deciding to. Work schedules shifted, plans were postponed. I made room for appointments and check-ins and unexpected needs. My brother called occasionally, his concern expressed in general terms. "Let me know if things get bad. Tell me if you need help." I thanked him, knowing I wouldn't ask. As my mother recovered, her dependence shifted from immediate medical needs back into familiar territory. Financial questions resurfaced. She mentioned stress. She mentioned worries about my brother's situation. She framed everything as concern, as care. I listened, absorbing it all, feeling something tighten in my chest each time. I started noticing patterns I had trained myself not to see. How conversations ended when solutions were found, not when emotions were shared. How my contributions were treated as expected, not appreciated. How any hint of strain on my part was met with reassurance about my strength instead of support. Strength, I was learning, had become a way to keep me from needing anything. One evening, after a particularly long day, I sat alone at my kitchen table and tried to name what I was feeling. It wasn't anger, not exactly. It wasn't sadness either. It was a hollow sensation, like something essential had been overlooked for so long that it had started to feel invisible. I realized I didn't feel like a daughter in this dynamic. I felt like a system, reliable, functional, replaceable. That thought scared me more than anything else, because systems don't get asked how they're doing. Systems don't get cared for. They just get used until they fail. I remembered moments from childhood with sudden clarity, times when I had tried, quietly, to be seen, showing a report card, sharing a small success, bringing up something that mattered to me. Each time the attention shifted quickly, redirected towards something more urgent, more concerning, more pressing. I had learned then that my needs were optional, convenient to ignore. It struck me how early I had learned to manage my disappointment alone, how practiced I was at smoothing over the ache before it reached the surface. That skill had served me in many ways. It had helped me build a life, but it had also taught me to tolerate emotional absence as normal. As the weeks passed, my mother regained more independence. Physically, she was improving. Emotionally, nothing changed. She still spoke to me primarily in terms of tasks and worries. She still framed my brother as fragile, as someone who needed protection. And I still filled the gaps, but something in me had shifted. The hollow feeling hadn't gone away, it had sharpened. It was asking questions I couldn't ignore anymore. I began to notice how tense my body felt before her calls, how my shoulders tightened, how my breath shortened. I noticed how relief washed over me when conversations ended. These weren't signs of a healthy bond. They were signs of endurance. One afternoon, while waiting in my car after another appointment, I imagined what it would sound like if my mother asked a simple question. How are you holding up? The imagined words felt foreign, almost unrealistic. That realization hurt more than I expected. I thought about boundaries then, not as something dramatic or final, but as a concept, as a line that defined where I ended and others began. I realized I had never drawn that line with my family. I had been raised to believe that drawing it would be an act of betrayal, that saying no would mean abandonment. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had spent my life preventing abandonment by abandoning myself. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't announce changes. I simply started paying attention to my internal reactions, to the moments when I felt drained instead of fulfilled, to the difference between obligation and choice. That awareness alone began to change things. When my brother's situation escalated again, the familiar request came wrapped in urgency. It wasn't presented as a demand. It was framed as concern, as necessity. I listened, heart pounding, aware that this moment felt heavier than others before it. I didn't respond immediately. The silence stretched. My mother filled it with explanations, with reasons, with reassurances about my capacity. Each word pressed against that hollow space inside me. For the first time, I noticed the choice in front of me. It wasn't a loud choice. It didn't announce itself. It simply existed. Say yes and reinforce the pattern, or pause and feel what it meant to hesitate. That hesitation felt terrifying. It also felt honest. I told her I needed time to think. The words surprised both of us. She didn't argue. She sounded confused. The call ended without resolution, and my hands shook afterward. Not from fear of conflict, but from the unfamiliarity of prioritizing my own response. That night, sleep didn't come easily. My mind raced through consequences, imagined reactions, possible fallout. I realized how deeply I had internalized responsibility for everyone else's emotional comfort. Even considering a boundary felt like a threat. But beneath the fear, there was something else. A small, steady sense of alignment. As if I had finally acknowledged a truth I had carried silently for years. I didn't know yet what I would do. I only knew that returning automatically to my old role no longer felt possible. Something had cracked open, and cracks, once formed, have a way of letting light in whether you're ready or not. I lay there listening to the quiet of my apartment, aware of how alone I was in that moment, and how, paradoxically, that aloneness felt more honest than anything I had felt in a long time. I didn't have answers. I didn't have a plan. What I had was awareness. And awareness, I was beginning to understand, is where change starts. The silence after I told my mother I needed time stayed with me longer than I expected. It followed me through the next few days like a low hum under everything else. At work, I caught myself rereading the same email 3 times. At home, I moved through routines on autopilot, aware that something fundamental was shifting, even if I couldn't yet name what it was. I hadn't said no, not yet, but I also hadn't said yes, and in my family, that pause alone was a disruption. My mother called again 2 days later. Her tone was different, still calm, still controlled, but with an edge of impatience that hadn't been there before. She asked if I had thought about it. Not how I was feeling, not whether I was overwhelmed, just whether I had reached a decision. I felt the familiar pressure rise in my chest, that urge to smooth things over, to reassure her that everything would be fine. Instead, I took a breath and asked a question I had never asked out loud. What happens if I can't fix this? The line went quiet. Not disconnected, just silent. When she spoke again, her voice carried confusion more than anger. "You always do," she said, as if that settled the matter. Something tightened inside me, not because she was wrong, but because she was so certain. Her certainty was built on years of my compliance, on a version of me that had learned to adapt rather than object. I realized then that she wasn't asking me to help, she was assuming I would. And assumptions are powerful things. They don't feel like demands, but they carry the same weight. I told her I couldn't commit to covering the situation long term. I didn't explain myself in detail. I didn't justify. I simply stated a limit. The words felt strange in my mouth, like a new language. She responded by listing reasons. Not arguments exactly, but reminders of how much she had handled alone, of how worried she was, of how fragile my brother felt right now. Each sentence was familiar. Each one had worked on me before. This time, something in me stayed still. The conversation ended politely, but there was a chill to it. When I hung up, my heart was racing. I sat on the couch and let the feeling wash through me. Fear, guilt, relief. They came in waves, overlapping, hard to separate. I realized how deeply my nervous system associated boundaries with danger. Saying no didn't feel neutral. It felt like stepping off a ledge. That night, my brother texted. He said Mom told him I was being distant, that things were stressful. He didn't accuse me outright, but the implication was clear. He asked if everything was okay. I stared at the message for a long time before replying. I wanted to explain. I wanted to be understood. Instead, I typed something simple and non-committal. I needed some space to think. He replied with a thumbs up emoji. The conversation ended there. I lay awake replaying it all, my mind searching for the right interpretation. Was I being unfair? Overreacting? Had I misread everything? Those questions circled endlessly, because self-doubt had always been easier than self-trust. It took effort to remind myself that discomfort didn't automatically mean I was wrong. Sometimes it just meant I was doing something new. As the days passed, the situation escalated without me. Bills went unpaid. Deadlines loomed. My mother mentioned these developments casually, as if they were background noise rather than consequences. Each update felt like a test, a chance for me to step back in and restore order. I felt the pull intensely. The desire to fix things wasn't gone. It was ingrained. But alongside it was a growing awareness of how much it cost me. I began noticing how often my body tensed when my phone rang, how my breathing changed when I saw my mother's name on the screen. These reactions weren't random. They were data. And for the first time, I treated them as information rather than inconveniences. The breaking point didn't come with a dramatic confrontation. It arrived quietly, disguised as practicality. My mother called one afternoon and asked if I could transfer money that evening. Just temporarily, she said, just until things stabilized. Her voice carried the familiar mix of reassurance and urgency. I listened, my chest tight, and something in me finally reached its limit. "I can't do that," I said. The words hung between us, solid and undeniable. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. She sounded genuinely surprised, as if the possibility hadn't occurred to her. "I don't understand," she said. "Why are you making this harder than it needs to be?" That question landed heavily, because it revealed the core of everything. To her, my role had always been to make things easier for everyone else. My needs had never factored into that equation. They weren't part of the problem-solving process. I tried to explain, but my explanation wasn't what she wanted. I spoke about limits, about sustainability, about how I couldn't keep absorbing consequences that weren't mine. She listened, but I could hear the distance forming. Not because she disagreed, but because she didn't recognize this version of me. Her response was quiet. "You've changed," she said. She wasn't wrong, but the way she said it made change sound like a flaw. After that call, I sat alone in my living room and let myself feel everything I had been holding back. The grief surprised me. Not grief for money or logistics, but for the relationship I had hoped for. The one where my value wasn't tied to what I provided. The one where care flowed both ways. I realized I had been waiting for that version of my mother to appear for decades. Waiting had cost me more than I understood. If you've ever reached a moment where you realize the role you've been playing no longer fits, and you don't yet know what replaces it, you know how disorienting that space can be. You're not moving forward or backward, you're just standing still, aware that everything is different now. The fallout didn't explode immediately. It unfolded slowly. Conversations became shorter, updates became colder. My brother stopped reaching out entirely. The family dynamic adjusted around my absence, and that adjustment stung in ways I hadn't anticipated. Part of me had believed that stepping back would force a reckoning. Instead, it revealed how easily the system recalibrated without me. That realization hurt deeply. It forced me to confront an uncomfortable truth. Being indispensable had been part of my identity, but it hadn't made me irreplaceable. The family had relied on me, yes, but it hadn't necessarily valued me in the way I needed. The emotional weight of that understanding pressed down on me. I questioned myself constantly. Was I too rigid? Too sensitive? I searched for validation in conversations with friends, careful not to frame myself as the victim. Their responses were gentle but firm. They reminded me of things I had normalized for too long. They asked questions my family never had. As the tension grew, my mother's messages shifted. Less logistical, more personal. She spoke about how abandoned she felt, how alone, how she hadn't expected this from me. Each word was measured, not explosive, but heavy with implication. I recognized the pattern immediately. It was the same one I had responded to my entire life. The difference was that now, I could see it clearly. One evening, after reading another message that left me feeling responsible for her emotional state, I put my phone down and stared at the wall. I realized that no matter what I did, someone would be disappointed. The only question was whether that person would continue to be me. That clarity didn't erase the pain, but it sharpened my resolve. I couldn't keep choosing a version of peace that required my constant self-erasure. The cost was too high. I felt it in my body, in my mind, in the quiet moments when I couldn't remember what I wanted outside of other people's needs. The situation reached its peak when my mother showed up unannounced at my apartment. I heard the knock late in the evening, unexpected and insistent. My heart pounded as I stood up, already bracing myself. This wasn't a conversation she wanted to have over the phone. As I walked toward the door, I knew something was about to change permanently. There are moments in life when the air feels charged, when you sense that whatever happens next will define the shape of things to come. This was one of them. Before I opened it, I took a breath and reminded myself why I had paused in the first place, why I had hesitated, why I had said no. I wasn't trying to punish anyone. I was trying to survive with integrity. I opened the door and met her eyes, aware that the next few minutes would either pull me back into the old pattern or push me fully into something new. The choice, terrifying and liberating, was finally mine. She stood there with her coat still on, purse clutched tightly against her side, as if she hadn't decided whether she was coming in or preparing to leave. For a second, neither of us spoke. The hallway light behind me cast a soft shadow across her face, and I noticed details I usually avoided. The tightness around her mouth, the way her shoulders stayed slightly raised, even at rest. She looked smaller than I remembered, but not fragile, tense, contained. "I didn't know where else to go," she said finally. The words landed heavily, not because they were dramatic, but because they were familiar. They carried the weight of expectation without naming it. I stepped aside and let her in. Part of me wondered whether that alone was a concession, whether opening the door meant opening myself back up. But I reminded myself that boundaries weren't walls, they were filters. Letting someone in didn't mean surrendering everything. She sat on the edge of the couch, back straight, hands folded in her lap. I stayed standing for a moment, grounding myself in the sensation of my feet on the floor. I didn't offer tea. I didn't rush to fill the silence. That was new. Silence had always made me uncomfortable. It still did, but I stayed with it. She looked around the apartment as if seeing it for the first time. Clean, quiet, orderly. A life that functioned without her involvement. I wondered what that realization stirred in her. "I don't recognize you lately," she said, not unkindly. "You've been distant." I resisted the urge to apologize. That impulse was strong, almost reflexive. Instead, I asked her what she meant. "You used to talk to me," she said. "You used to help." There it was. Talk and help had always been interchangeable in her language. I sat down across from her, leaving space between us. Physical distance felt important, not as punishment, but as a reminder that I was allowed to take up room. "I still talk to you," I said. I just don't fix everything anymore. Her eyes narrowed slightly, confusion flickering across her face. I don't see the difference. That honesty startled me. She truly didn't. In her world, connection had always been transactional. Care was demonstrated through problem solving. Emotional presence without utility didn't register. I tried to explain, slowly, carefully. I talked about how tired I was, how overwhelmed, how I needed to stop stepping in automatically. I spoke about balance, about sustainability, about wanting a relationship that didn't revolve around crisis management. I avoided blame. I focused on impact. She listened without interrupting, but I could tell she wasn't hearing what I meant. Her posture stayed rigid, her expression guarded. When I finished, she sighed. I raised you to be strong, she said. I didn't think that would become a problem. Something inside me ached at that. Not because the words were cruel, but because they revealed how little space there had ever been for anything else. Strength, in her mind, wasn't a trait. It was a requirement. I don't want to stop being strong, I said quietly. I just don't want strength to mean silence. She shook her head, as if that distinction felt unnecessary. Your brother needs support, she said. He's struggling. I noticed how quickly the conversation returned to him, how naturally his needs reclaimed center stage. The familiar imbalance pressed in on me, but this time I didn't retreat. I know he is, I said, but that doesn't mean I'm responsible for fixing it. Her jaw tightened. Family doesn't work that way. I looked at her, really looked at her, and felt a strange mix of compassion and resolve. She wasn't trying to hurt me. She was defending a system that had worked for her, one that distributed responsibility unevenly, but predictably. Change threatened that predictability. Maybe it doesn't have to work that way anymore, I said. The room felt heavier after that. The air thickened with unspoken fear. Her fear, I realized, not of losing money or control, but of losing the structure she relied on, of facing uncertainty without the buffer I had always provided. She leaned forward, her voice lowering. I don't understand why you're doing this now. I thought about that question for a long time before answering. Because the truth wasn't simple. It wasn't one event or one argument. It was an accumulation. Years of being the stable one, years of absorbing stress, years of waiting for recognition that never came. I didn't realize I was allowed to stop before, I said. That was the moment her expression changed, not to anger, to something closer to alarm, as if a rule she had never known she depended on had just been revoked. She stood up abruptly, pacing the small space. So what, you're just going to walk away? No, I said. I'm going to stand in a different place. She stopped and turned to face me. And where does that leave me? The question carried more than logistics. It carried years of reliance, of expectation, of unspoken contracts. I felt the weight of it settle on my chest. Old instincts surged. Fix this, reassure her, make it okay. Instead, I answered honestly. It leaves you figuring some things out without me stepping in first. Her eyes filled with tears, and for a moment I faltered. Guilt rushed in, sharp and immediate. This was the response I had always feared, proof that my boundaries caused pain, proof that my absence mattered. But beneath the guilt, there was clarity. Her distress wasn't new, it was just no longer being managed for her. She sat back down, defeated. I didn't expect this from you, she said softly. I nodded. I know. The conversation unraveled after that. Not in anger, but in quiet disconnection. We talked in circles, returning to the same points from different angles. She framed my choices as abandonment. I framed them as preservation. We never reached agreement. When she left, the apartment felt eerily quiet. I stood by the door long after it closed, listening to the sound of her footsteps fade down the hallway. My body trembled, adrenaline still coursing through me. I had confronted something I had spent my entire life avoiding, and it hadn't resolved cleanly. That night was long. Sleep came in fragments. I woke with my jaw clenched, my thoughts looping through everything I might have said differently. I replayed her expressions, her tone, her words. I questioned my timing, my delivery, my right to draw lines at all. In the morning, there was a message from my brother. Short, direct. He said Mom was upset, that she felt pushed away, that he didn't understand what was happening. The subtext was clear. Fix this. I stared at the screen, feeling the familiar pull, the urge to explain, to justify, to soothe, to return to the role that promised temporary peace at the expense of my own stability. I didn't respond immediately. I went for a walk instead, letting the cold air steady me. I noticed how my shoulders gradually relaxed, how my breathing slowed. I thought about the night before, about the discomfort, about the unresolved tension. I realized something important. Boundaries don't always bring relief right away. Sometimes they bring grief first. Over the next few days, communication dwindled. My mother sent a few clipped messages. My brother stayed silent. The distance hurt more than I expected. Even when relationships are imbalanced, they are still relationships. Losing familiar patterns, even harmful ones, creates its own kind of loss. I mourned not just what was happening, but what I had hoped for. The version of my family that could adjust, that could see me differently, that could meet me halfway. Letting go of that hope felt like admitting defeat, but it also felt like telling the truth. As the tension settled into something more stable, I noticed changes in myself. I slept better. I felt less reactive. I started noticing my own preferences again. Small things at first. What I wanted to eat. How I wanted to spend an evening. The quiet space left by my absence from constant crisis allowed other parts of me to surface. The climax wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was the slow realization that I could survive this discomfort. That the world didn't collapse when I stopped holding it together for everyone else. That the pain, while real, was not fatal. One evening, I sat on my couch and thought about the person I had been for most of my life. The one who equated love with labor. The one who believed that being indispensable was the same as being cherished. I felt compassion for her. She had done the best she could with what she knew. But I also felt ready to let her rest. The confrontation with my mother hadn't resolved everything. It hadn't healed old wounds or rewritten history. What it had done was make the truth visible. And once visible, it demanded a response. I didn't know yet what the next phase would look like. I only knew that I couldn't go back. The climax wasn't an ending. It was a point of no return. And standing there, in the aftermath, I understood that the hardest part of change isn't making a decision, it's living with it. The days after my mother's visit settled into a strange stillness. Not peace exactly, but quiet. The kind of quiet that follows a storm, when you're not sure if it has truly passed or is only gathering strength somewhere out of sight. I went back to work, answered emails, attended meetings, and spoke to colleagues who had no idea that something foundational in my life had shifted. From the outside, everything looked the same. Inside, I felt as though I was learning how to stand on a new surface, unsure which parts of my weight it could hold. For the first time in years, my phone stayed mostly silent. No urgent calls, no updates delivered in anxious fragments, no subtle reminders of responsibility. The absence was unsettling. I kept reaching for my phone out of habit, only to find nothing there. It made me realize how much of my daily rhythm had been shaped by other people's needs. Without them, time felt unfamiliar, almost too open. At first, that openness scared me. I filled it with distractions, extra hours at work, long walks, background noise that kept my thoughts from drifting too far. But gradually, something else began to emerge. Space. Space to notice how my body felt when it wasn't braced for impact. Space to hear my own thoughts without immediately editing them for usefulness. I started paying attention to the small ways I had been managing stress without realizing it. How I held my breath when reading messages. How my jaw stayed clenched even in moments of rest. As those patterns eased, I felt both relief and sadness. Relief that my body could relax. Sadness that it had been living in tension for so long. My mother sent a message a week later. It was short, factual, and polite. She told me about an appointment, mentioned that my brother was handling some things now, and ended with a line that felt carefully neutral. I stared at it, searching for subtext. Old habits urged me to respond with reassurance, with offers, with availability. I typed a reply, deleted it, and tried again. In the end, I responded simply. I acknowledged the information. I wished her well. I didn't offer anything beyond that. When I hit send, my hands shook slightly. Not because I feared her reaction, but because I was choosing a different pattern. One that felt both empowering and fragile. That exchange marked the beginning of a new phase. Not resolution, but adjustment. The system that had relied on me was reorganizing, not gracefully, not without friction, but it was happening. And I was on the outside of it, watching, resisting the urge to step back in. I noticed how often guilt surfaced in unexpected moments. At the grocery store, in the shower, late at night when the world grew quiet. Guilt is persistent. It doesn't need a trigger. It feeds on long-standing beliefs. Mine whispered that I was selfish, that I was abandoning my family, that I was failing at something essential. But alongside the guilt was something else, a growing sense of self-respect. It didn't arrive with confidence or certainty. It arrived quietly, like a steady presence that reminded me why I had made this choice. I began to understand that guilt and wrongdoing are not the same thing. Feeling bad didn't automatically mean I was wrong. I also began to see my brother more clearly. Not as a villain, not as someone intentionally harmful, but as a person shaped by the same system I was stepping out of. A system that had taught him reliance instead of accountability. I felt a mix of empathy and frustration. Empathy for the pressure he likely felt. Frustration that his struggles had so often been cushioned by my efforts. One afternoon he called. His voice sounded hesitant, unsure. He asked how I was doing, and I realized how rare that question had been between us. I answered honestly, but briefly. He spoke about stress, about confusion, about not knowing what to do next. I listened without offering solutions. The silence that followed felt heavy. "I just thought you'd help," he said finally. Not accusing, just stating a belief. "I've helped for a long time," I said. "I need to do something different now." He didn't argue. He sounded disappointed, but also resigned. The call ended awkwardly, without resolution. I sat with the discomfort, resisting the urge to follow up with advice or reassurance. This was part of the shift, letting others feel their own discomfort without rushing to erase it. In the weeks that followed, my life began to reorient itself around choices rather than obligations. I started making decisions based on what I wanted instead of what I anticipated others would need. Sometimes those choices were small. Cooking a meal I liked instead of something quick and practical. Saying no to social plans when I felt tired. Allowing myself to rest without earning it. Other times, the choices were heavier. Turning down requests that tugged at old instincts. Sitting with the knowledge that someone might be upset with me. Learning that being misunderstood didn't automatically mean I needed to correct the misunderstanding. I began therapy again, this time with a clearer focus, not on fixing relationships, but on understanding myself within them. We talked about emotional labor, about family roles, about how certain children become the stabilizers by default. Naming those patterns felt validating. It gave language to experiences I had long normalized. Through those conversations, I began to see how deeply my sense of worth had been tied to productivity, to usefulness, to being the one who could handle things. Letting go of that identity felt like losing a part of myself. But it also made room for something new, a version of me that didn't need to prove her value through exhaustion. The turning point didn't arrive with an argument or a declaration. It arrived on an ordinary afternoon when I realized I hadn't thought about my family for several hours. I had been absorbed in my own life, my own interests, my own sense of time. The realization startled me, not because it felt wrong, but because it felt peaceful. I understood then that stepping back wasn't about punishment or withdrawal. It was about recalibration, about restoring balance where there had been none. That clarity didn't erase the pain of distance, but it reframed it. The discomfort I felt was part of growth, not evidence of failure. My mother reached out again a month later. This time, her message was different, less transactional. She mentioned feeling tired, confused. She didn't ask for anything directly. I read it slowly, aware of the shift in tone. I also noticed something else. She still didn't ask how I was. I sat with that realization longer than I expected. It brought sadness, but not surprise. I responded kindly, but briefly, maintaining the boundary I had set. The conversation ended there. It wasn't warm, it wasn't hostile, it was limited. And for now, that felt right. As weeks turned into months, the emotional intensity softened, the sharp edges dulled. I no longer jumped when my phone rang. I slept more deeply. I laughed more easily. I felt present in my own life in a way I hadn't for years. These changes weren't dramatic, but they were profound. I also noticed how my sense of self expanded beyond my family role. I reconnected with interests I had set aside. I invested energy into friendships that felt reciprocal. I allowed myself to imagine a future that wasn't built around crisis management. The decision I had made wasn't a single act. It was a series of choices, repeated over time, each one reinforcing the next, each one strengthening a boundary that had once felt impossible. Near the end of one therapy session, my therapist asked me how I would describe the difference between who I was before and who I was becoming. I thought about it carefully. Before, I was always bracing, I said. Now, I'm standing. That distinction mattered. Bracing is temporary, standing is sustainable. If you've ever found yourself in a similar place, learning how to step out of a role that once defined you, you know how lonely that transition can feel. It helps to remember that choosing yourself doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you start caring honestly. The final shift came quietly, almost imperceptibly. One evening, as I sat alone with my thoughts, I realized that I no longer felt the urge to explain myself. Not to my mother, not to my brother, not to anyone. I knew why I had made my choices. That knowledge felt sufficient. And just before I turned the page into whatever came next, I felt the need to acknowledge something important. Change doesn't always announce itself with clarity. Sometimes it asks you to trust your own experience before anyone else understands it. If you're in that place right now, you don't have to rush your way out of it. What mattered most was that I had crossed a threshold. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was choosing. And that choice, once made, reshaped everything that followed. The change didn't announce itself with confidence. It didn't arrive as certainty or closure. It showed up as something quieter and more demanding. Responsibility. Not the kind I had been carrying for years, but responsibility for my own inner life, for my reactions, for the choices I made when no one was watching and no one was asking anything of me. Without the constant pull of my family's needs, there was more room to notice what was happening inside me. And what I noticed wasn't always comfortable. Beneath the relief and growing steadiness, there was anger I had never allowed myself to feel fully. Not explosive anger, not rage, but a deep, steady resentment that had been buried under duty for most of my life. I had told myself I didn't resent my mother. I had framed my feelings as understanding, as compassion, as acceptance of her limitations. But now, with distance, I could see that understanding had often been a shield, a way to avoid confronting how much I had given up to keep the peace, how often I had been expected to absorb disappointment without protest. Anger surfaced in unexpected moments, while folding laundry, while driving, while watching a movie where a mother listened to her daughter with care and curiosity. Each time it startled me. I had been so practiced at minimizing my own feelings that allowing anger felt dangerous, almost disloyal. But I also sensed that ignoring it would only keep me tied to the past. In therapy, we talked about this shift, about how anger, when acknowledged, isn't destructive by default, how it can be information, a signal that something mattered and wasn't honored. That perspective reframed everything. Instead of pushing the feeling away, I learned to sit with it, to ask what it needed to tell me. What it told me was simple and devastating. I had needed to be seen, not for what I could manage, but for who I was. I had needed my mother to notice my effort, my exhaustion, my limits. I had needed her to ask, even once, whether the load was too heavy. Grieving that unmet need was harder than setting boundaries had been. Boundaries were active. Grief was passive. It required stillness. It required acknowledging that something fundamental hadn't happened and never might. That acceptance felt like giving up, even though I knew it wasn't. As I worked through that grief, my interactions with my family continued to shift. My mother reached out occasionally, her messages oscillating between formality and subtle appeal. Sometimes she framed her words carefully, as if testing whether a softer approach would draw me back in. Other times, there was a trace of bitterness, a reminder that my absence was felt. I noticed how my reactions changed. Where I once would have felt compelled to respond immediately, now I paused. I checked in with myself before replying. I asked what I wanted to communicate, not what would keep things calm. That internal check became a quiet practice, one that grounded me. My brother, too, adjusted in his own way. He began handling things more directly, sometimes clumsily, sometimes resentfully. There were moments when I saw him struggling and felt the old urge to step in. The desire didn't disappear overnight. It softened gradually, replaced by a recognition that growth often requires discomfort. We spoke less frequently, but when we did, the conversations were different. Less assumption, more caution. He no longer spoke as if my support was guaranteed. That change carried its own weight. It signaled a shift in how he saw me, not just as a safety net, but as a person with limits. This period felt like standing in the middle of a bridge. The old shore behind me, familiar but no longer accessible. The new one ahead, not yet fully visible. I couldn't rush forward without understanding what I was leaving behind. I couldn't go back without undoing the progress I had made. What surprised me most was how lonely this stage felt. Not the loneliness of abandonment, but the loneliness of differentiation. When you stop playing a role that defined you, even people who care about you may not know how to relate to you anymore. That distance can feel isolating, even when it's necessary. I leaned more heavily on friendships during this time, not for validation, but for connection that didn't come with expectations. I paid attention to how it felt to be around people who didn't need me to perform competence, who didn't see my strength as an excuse to take more. That contrast was instructive. Slowly, my sense of identity began to reorganize. I noticed how often I had described myself in terms of what I did for others: reliable, helpful, supportive. Those traits were still part of me, but they were no longer the foundation. I began exploring other descriptors: curious, thoughtful, creative. At first, they felt tentative, like borrowed clothes. Over time, they fit more comfortably. The turning point within this phase came during an ordinary conversation with my mother. She mentioned feeling overwhelmed and then paused, as if waiting. I recognized the moment instantly. The familiar opening. The expectation that I would fill the silence with solutions. I didn't. Instead, I said, "That sounds hard." She seemed caught off guard. She acknowledged it and moved on. The conversation continued without escalation. When we hung up, I sat quietly, processing what had just happened. I had offered empathy without taking responsibility. I had stayed present without stepping in. It felt balanced, sustainable. That moment mattered more than any confrontation could have. It showed me that I could remain connected without reverting to old patterns. That boundaries didn't require distance to exist. They required clarity. At the same time, I had to accept that clarity wouldn't guarantee understanding. My mother still interpreted my changes through her own lens. Sometimes she framed them as withdrawal, sometimes as rejection. I couldn't control that. Learning to tolerate being misunderstood was part of the work. There were days when doubt crept back in, when I wondered if I had overcorrected, if I had become too guarded. Those doubts were especially loud when guilt resurfaced. I learned to recognize guilt not as a directive, but as a remnant of conditioning, a signal from an old system, not necessarily a reflection of present reality. One evening, while journaling, I wrote a sentence that surprised me. I am allowed to disappoint people who benefit from my self-neglect. Seeing it on the page felt both liberating and unsettling. It challenged a core belief I had carried for decades, that my worth was tied to how little inconvenience I caused. As I continued this internal work, I noticed a subtle but important shift in how I related to myself. I became more forgiving, less critical. I stopped expecting myself to navigate this transition perfectly. I allowed for missteps, for moments of uncertainty, for days when I missed the simplicity of my old role. That compassion made room for something else. Confidence. Not the loud kind, but a quiet trust in my own judgment. I began to rely less on external validation. I didn't need constant reassurance that I was doing the right thing. I knew why I had chosen this path. That knowledge steadied me. The breakthrough didn't happen all at once. It unfolded over weeks, then months, in small decisions, in how I spent my time, in the absence of chronic tension. One day I realized I hadn't rehearsed conversations in my head for hours. I hadn't anticipated disaster. I had simply lived. That realization felt like freedom. My relationship with my mother settled into a new, limited shape. We spoke occasionally. The conversations stayed surface level. There was a distance that hadn't existed before, but it was honest. I no longer pretended closeness where there wasn't reciprocity. That honesty felt kinder than false harmony. My brother and I found a tentative equilibrium, not close, not estranged. Something in between. I stopped trying to manage his outcomes. He stopped expecting me to. It wasn't warm, but it was real. Through all of this, I learned that turning points aren't always marked by dramatic events. Sometimes they are marked by restraint, by the decision not to act, by the ability to sit with discomfort without rushing to eliminate it. The most significant shift happened internally. I stopped seeing myself as a resource to be managed. I started seeing myself as a person with an inner life that deserved attention. That shift changed how I moved through the world. I began making choices that aligned with who I was becoming, not who I had been expected to be. I invested energy where it was returned. I rested without guilt. I trusted my instincts more. Each choice reinforced the next, creating a new pattern. By the end of this phase, I could feel the ground beneath my feet more solidly. I wasn't waiting for approval anymore. I wasn't bracing for backlash. I was grounded in my own experience. The old story, the one where my value was measured by my usefulness, had begun to lose its hold. In its place, a new understanding took root. I didn't need to be indispensable to be worthy. I didn't need to disappear to keep others comfortable. That realization wasn't loud. It didn't demand attention, but it changed everything. I was no longer standing in the middle of the bridge. I had crossed it. I didn't wake up one morning feeling complete or healed. There was no moment where everything suddenly made sense and the past neatly reorganized itself. What happened instead was quieter and more durable. I began to trust myself. That trust showed up in small, ordinary ways, in how I made decisions without immediately imagining how they would affect everyone else, in how I listened to my body when it signaled fatigue or unease instead of overriding it out of habit, in how I allowed my feelings to exist without demanding they justify themselves through productivity or usefulness. For a long time, I had believed that clarity would come from resolution, from conversations that ended with mutual understanding, from apologies that named every harm precisely and made space for repair. I had waited for those things, hoping they would give me permission to move forward. What I learned instead was that permission didn't come from others. It came from me. I stopped expecting my family to validate my experience, not because I stopped caring, but because I recognized the limits of what they were able or willing to offer. Accepting those limits wasn't the same as approving of them. It was an act of realism, one that freed me from the endless cycle of hope and disappointment. My relationship with my mother continued in its reduced form. We spoke occasionally, carefully, staying within topics that didn't invite old dynamics to resurface. There were moments when she hinted at wanting more closeness, and moments when she retreated behind formality. I no longer tried to interpret these shifts. I met them where they were. Sometimes, I still felt a pang of sadness when I realized how different our relationship was from what I had once imagined. That sadness didn't undo my progress. It simply reminded me that grief and growth often coexist. I could honor what I wished had been without sacrificing what I had built. With my brother, the distance settled into something neutral. We were no longer locked into our old roles. We weren't particularly close, but we weren't hostile either. We existed side by side, each managing our own lives. That separation felt healthy, even if it wasn't warm. What surprised me most was how much energy I suddenly had, emotional energy, mental space, without the constant vigilance, the constant anticipation of other people's needs. My mind felt clearer. I became more present at work, more engaged in conversations, more curious about the world around me. I started noticing how often I had minimized myself in the past, how I had softened my opinions, diluted my desires, adjusted my tone to avoid discomfort. Those habits didn't disappear overnight, but they loosened their grip. Each time I spoke honestly, without apologizing, I felt a small surge of confidence. Confidence, I learned, isn't about being certain. It's about being aligned. When your actions match your values, there's a steadiness that doesn't require constant reinforcement. I began to recognize that feeling and trust it. I also redefined what strength meant to me. Strength was no longer about endurance at any cost. It was about discernment, about knowing when to engage and when to step back, about choosing care over obligation. That shift reframed my entire history. The younger version of me hadn't been weak for wanting recognition. She had been human. There were moments when old memories surfaced unexpectedly. Scenes from childhood, conversations I hadn't thought about in years. Instead of pushing them away, I let them pass through me. I acknowledged the hurt without trying to fix it. I offered compassion to the parts of myself that had learned to survive through self-erasure. That compassion changed how I spoke to myself. The inner critic that had once driven me softened. I stopped demanding constant resilience. I allowed rest to be rest, not recovery time for the next obligation. I allowed joy without justification. Over time, I noticed how my sense of worth stabilized. It no longer fluctuated based on how much I was doing for others. It felt intrinsic, not flashy or inflated, but steady, like something that didn't need to be proven. The most meaningful affirmation came not from a dramatic event, but from a quiet realization. I was living my life without constantly checking whether it was acceptable to anyone else. That autonomy felt grounding. It made even difficult days feel manageable. I understood then that boundaries weren't a phase or a reaction. They were a practice, something I would return to again and again as circumstances changed. Not rigid lines, but living guidelines that kept me connected to myself. Looking back, I could see how far I had come. From a child who learned to disappear to keep peace, to an adult who could remain present without self-betrayal. That transformation hadn't required anyone else to change. It had required me to stop waiting. I didn't regret the care I had given in the past. It had been sincere. It had come from love. What I no longer accepted was the idea that care had to cost me my identity. That lesson felt hard-earned and deeply personal. If there was one truth I carried forward, it was this. Being someone's daughter did not require me to abandon myself. Family did not have to mean sacrifice without consent. Love did not have to be earned through exhaustion. I began to build my future with those truths at the center. I made plans that excited me. I invested in relationships that felt mutual. I allowed my life to expand in directions that had once felt impractical or indulgent. There were still moments of doubt, still days when guilt whispered familiar stories. But those voices no longer dictated my actions. I could hear them without obeying them. That difference mattered. The affirmation I arrived at wasn't loud or defiant. It was simple and durable. I am allowed to exist without being useful. I am allowed to choose myself without being cruel. I am allowed to live a life that feels honest. even if others don't understand it. That understanding didn't close every wound, but it gave me a framework for moving forward, one that honored both my past and my present without forcing them to compete. I didn't need my family to see me differently in order to see myself clearly. That realization brought a sense of peace I hadn't known before. Not the peace of resolution, but the peace of self-recognition. As I moved through the world now, I felt anchored. Not because everything was easy, but because I trusted my capacity to respond with integrity. That trust was the true affirmation, one that didn't depend on anyone else's approval. This was the life I was building, one grounded in choice, not obligation, in clarity, not endurance, in self-respect, not self-sacrifice. And for the first time, that felt like enough. These days, my life is quieter in a way I once didn't know how to tolerate. I wake up without a sense of urgency pressing against my chest. My days are shaped by choices instead of reactions. I still work hard, I still care deeply, but I'm no longer living on alert, waiting for the next problem to solve. There's a steadiness inside me now. Not happiness all the time, not perfection, just a grounded feeling that I am allowed to exist as I am. My relationships are fewer, but they are clearer. My energy feels like it belongs to me again. And for the first time in my adult life, that feels like freedom. What this experience taught me isn't about cutting people off or proving a point. It's about understanding the difference between love and obligation. I learned that being strong doesn't mean absorbing everything in silence. It means knowing your limits and respecting them. I learned that loyalty without choice turns into self-erasure, and that care given at the cost of your own well-being eventually becomes resentment, even if you don't want it to. Most of all, I learned that clarity is kinder than endurance, to yourself and to others. If you're listening to this and something in it feels uncomfortably familiar, I want you to hear this clearly. There is nothing wrong with you for feeling tired, conflicted, or unsure. There is nothing weak about wanting to be seen without having to earn it. You are not selfish for needing space. You are not cruel for choosing yourself. Setting boundaries doesn't mean you stop loving people. It means you stop disappearing to keep them comfortable. And you are allowed to take that step at your own pace, in your own way, without turning your pain into a performance. Healing doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like peace. Sometimes it looks like fewer explanations. Sometimes it looks like choosing not to respond, or responding differently, or letting go of roles that once kept you safe, but no longer let you breathe. If you're in that in-between place right now, where things feel unsettled but also strangely honest, you're not failing. You're transitioning. I didn't arrive here by being fearless. I arrived here by being honest, over and over again, even when it was uncomfortable. And if my story gave you even a small sense of permission to listen to yourself more closely, then it has done what it needed to do. If you feel like sharing what this brought up for you, or if you're curious about how this journey continues beyond this chapter, you're welcome to stay with me and listen to what comes next.